All hail Abraxas, Isis, Persephone, Kore. Now, recording the complete wrap-up and summary of the Prague mission and Nekyia. I'm going to start briefly by recounting the fact that upon arriving in Prague, we were arriving on the 20th. My first night there was one of my 12 Samyeza contact nights. And I was, of course, vaguely aware of the general connections between Kelley, Dee, and the Mountford lineage, and so I was already thinking along those lines on that night, and my time looking in on 1841 for the month of March while in Prague was in looking back from Mountford's view back through the conspiratorial lineage all the way back to Kelley and Dee and their whole deal and how it began. And that led me into a very, context-rich environment with which to really penetrate things. And then the fact that Kelley kept getting mentioned by all the guides that we were with on these tours, etc., etc., and the Faust connection, etc. So it was all being primed very well. And what I found the most interesting there is the Samyeza plot level, which is all prepped for, me, etc., as we know and have well documented for totally different reasons, involving Joseph Smith and his claims to have gotten the ancient seer stones, which came from the ancient American mysteries of the Atlantean forefathers in ancient America, etc. Now, there are shocking connections to that. And Dee and Kelley, which I didn't even know until just now when reading in this book, which I must record here. Just a quick shot inside this, one of the mysterious, gnomically delivered books. Here's Dr. Dee. This is Alchemy of the Ancient Science, the Supernatural. Here's Dr. Dee, we see, in his typically pompous Elizabethan phase. And here is our buddy Kelley. Nice picture of Kelley. And they point out a couple interesting things about Kelley in this book right away. The fact that he starts off in Scotland as Edward Talbot. And he's a forger. He's like a Mark Hoffman, Joseph Smith type forger. And he has to change his name to Kelley because he has to reinvent his identity because his identity as Talbot is burned by his criminal activities. And he gets his ears cut off as Talbot. He gets his ears shaved off. And that's why he has no ears, and that's why he always wore his hair in a very specific, weird way. And as Kelley, he was a very, mysterious, fast-talking cosmic character, let's say. And what is fascinating here is in this book, they say, early, Kelley had gotten a lot of his stuff from this kind of, random encounters with this guy in this bar who had this ancient manuscript on alchemy and mysterious powders. And so Kelley's a guy who has gnomic forces delivering him the goods synchronistically, right? He's very talented. He's got the luck of the cosmic delivering things from his Huor to him. And so, get this. He shows up early in 1582. Kelley turned up at Dr. Dee's house just outside London. At that time, Dee had just begun his experiments in scrying and crystal gazing. Here we go, the bomb. He had a glass sphere and a disc of polished black obsidian that had been brought back from Mexico by one of the early American explorers, both of which are now in the British Museum. He called these two objects his show stones. But he himself did not have the gift of sight, and he had to employ a medium to see and describe the visions that appeared in them. Kelley proved to be a skillful scryer, and soon he and Dee were spending every available moment in conjuring up visions of spirits and angels. We do not know whether he attempted to use this red powder of alchemy, blah, 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 this time. So what's important there is it is an Atlantean artifact, a seer stone, exactly as Joseph Smith used, and exactly as Mountford was using, as we'd already established in our plot level. And I had this book on the shelf before I went to Prague, but I never opened it or looked at it. It was just there, part of the mammoth wave of deliveries that have been coming through various places of the Blue Mitten bookstore. And so what happens here with Kelley and Dee is that they're getting a Native American artifact brought back from the Spanish conquest and the Spanish plot level that is referring again to that diagram that we've been harping on of Europe as an empress, as a woman, and the way that we have a complete anatomical view of Europe going on there. And these guys, Kelley and the D, are wandering Europe on the orders of Elizabeth, you see. Another important factor that's brought out in this book I was just reading about Kelley and D is that Elizabeth has some mother's agenda, of course, that they're trying to get accomplished. And during this period when D is in Prague with Kelley, Elizabeth is sending these messages and she's telling them to do these things, and Kelley is giving her the shutout. Kelley is not replying, and he's like turning his back on the mistress plan, shockingly. So this is even another layer of evidence of Kelley's crime, how he didn't want to bow down to the authority of the mothers and work for the goddess plan, which he was supposed to be taking orders from Queen Elizabeth, and her, whatever the secrets were that were coming out involving, such and such aspect of the, Rosicrucian agenda that D is being sent on, etc. So, in any event, now the Rosicrucian thing, which we're going to mention now as we segue into the Nekyia events, etc. The Rosicrucian, under the rose, the rose is in alchemy, the symbol of the work is, the rose, and the whole idea in Rosicrucianism is that they're under the rose. The rose is the symbol of the secret underworld and the underground brotherhood of the Rosicrucians. And they have the idea of, the rose cross, the Christ or the alchemical process seen as the unfolding of the rose is on the cross, meaning that it's, you're in a kind of night going in the Chapel Perilous Brotherhood scenario with the Rosicrucianism. And we must remember that the dwarves are heavily involved in this brotherhood aspect, and the 18th degree Scottish Rite, as practiced in the British Empire to this day, is the place where you're targeted by the dwarf-connected hierarchy behind all the Freemasonry rituals, which goes back to this European Rosicrucian character. So the Rose Cross, etc., is very important. It has to do also with Kar and Kore. Shockingly, as we found out in the Young book, which was delivered to us during our mission. Kore and Kar, the goddess of the spring, is one fundamental elemental view of what that Kore goddess means, coming out of the darkness into the light, and how even in our journey we arrived, it was the winter, and then spring sprung while we were there, after I did the descent into the realm and, confronted Persephone. That's when spring occurred. We started off in the snow with Hecate. And there's a whole wonderful goddess stream connected to the Rosicrucianism as well that now is opened up, and it's not just, like in the Da Vinci Code type stuff, Mary Magdalene is associated as the rose, and under the Rosicrucian Brotherhood is serving the Priory of Zion, protecting the rose against the elements and preserving it. And we must mention in the Stephen King Dark Tower, and I'll just get one of the most wonderful pictures in the whole Stephen King Dark Tower, and it's on the cover of The Wastelands, and you see it's the cosmic rose. It's the spiral galaxy, but it's also the actual rose itself. And Stephen King says that the symbol of the rose and the alchemical mandala as a functioning symbolic happening, in Jungian sense, is equivalent to the Dark Tower, or the tower that is, containing all the stages of the human story. And so I'll give another quick picture from this involving this rose, which is very important in our old cosmic history now. Of course, the gunslinger in the Dark Tower couldn't be more significant because it's like the Amber novels and the Amber Chronicles in, here it is. This is the picture. Of course, it's the young boy, the child, who's, find the rose, which it turns out in Stephen King's universe is in some burned-out parking lot up for sale in New York City in the 1970s, right? And Roland, the Mike Silva gunslinger, has to protect the child to get to the lot so they can, prevent the bulldozers of Hoover from, under the command of Satan, the Crimson King, the bulldozers are going to run over the, rose and destroy, the tower, etc., bring the great darkness. But so that's one plot, and a clever use of the symbology. But the idea is, like, at one point they look into the rose and they see there's the entire cosmos, and this is like also with the Rose Mandela, you're talking about all of the different parallel worlds orbiting around your one world. So it's not just one Earth; it's all the Earths. each different parallel world's like a different petal of the rose unfolding. And so, in the plot level of the Rosicrucians, what they're trying to do is, they're trying to foster the opening up of the rose of Europe at that time, the heart of Bohemia, as we have seen many times, and it's shown, of course, just quickly in this lovely diagram here, this picture. The heart of Bohemia is a rose, as we saw in the Straw Hat footage. We have a nice close-up on other big versions of that. But the Rosicrucian thing was trying to make it flower in the chakra way and bloom in Europe, and that is what was going on with Rudolph's court, hopefully. But of course, they couldn't make it finally open because the last phase, the last part of it, was a key locked by the magic circle nonsense of Edward Kelley. Okay, and one more picture I'm going to give as I'm going to read one last segment here. This book has been on my shelf for decades, and it's one of the key books that I stole from the library. And I stole it actually in my teenage years, stole a copy, and then lost it during New York when all my books were stolen. Then in 1997, I stole another copy. Stole the first one from the high school library. Stole the second one from the public library. And this book is like one of the big compendiums that has all kinds of lovely, happy, magical symbolism from all over. And in 97, I was using this when I was first understanding the Nekyia, the mothers, and the cosmic with my Jungian tutelage. But this is the wonderful picture here, if we can get a view on. Edward Kelley and Dr. D are summoning the spirits of the dead in some graveyard, okay? This is happening in England when they're first getting together, and they're using the Native Americans, stone to conjure up the angels, supposedly, Samyeza and the other chained angels who are chained behind the curtain, but still are sending out their messages and hoping of giving off a wonderful, plot level that's going to free them, which is what ultimately is going to happen with Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and the Grid, etc. And 1881, as we know. But Dr. D and Kelley's era with Samyeza, they're able at that time to free the angels, and that's what was. If Rudolph could have done that, as we know, everything would have been different, and then that would have been the real flowering, and the Rosicrucian underground would have been the above-ground, neo-classical cosmic world, let's say, and it'd be a whole different story, but that's, of course, not what happened. So, but the point is that the Kelley D mysticism that was going on there was the focus of my thread perception on March 20th, on my first night in Prague, which was the prelude that I was giving all this background to illuminate. So leaving us with a point of view of, I was seeing, for example, just for the first time, how the whole city of Prague is set up literally as, the angels' waiting room, where they're summoning up the angelic forces and the cosmic, stage is being set. And every corner of every street is bursting with a symbolic coding stimulus in an attempt to, agitate the neurons of the humans who are there. And of course, this is like, during Rudolph's time, it's not about the masses even. It's about, agitating the consciousness of a specific 144,000 type approach, a vanguard approach. All these guys he's drawn together. So it's about Dr. D and Kelley walking around the streets of Prague and getting some cosmic stimulus by looking at the Orloi, and then going and getting the Jewish, plot level in the Old Town. And Rabbi Low, who's contemporary with these guys, Low, L-O-W, he's the dwarf living above ground. And he's, with Rudolph, is puppeteering destiny in some strange way to try to make this angelic plot level pay off. No coincidence that in the Old New Synagogue, that Rabbi Low was the man in, and also right next to the synagogue, right next to the graveyard where the protocols of Elders of Zion say the conspiracy is planned from. This, Old New Synagogue is supposedly, built by the angels who take the stones of the ruined Temple of Solomon from Jerusalem to Prague in the year, 12 something something, and they build this pillar that's the foundation and the cornerstone, the beginning of this Old New Synagogue. And then at the end of time, at the end of the Messianic age, those stones are going to be deconstructed and taken back. And it's a whole, angelic plot. And so there's a whole, the whole city is like a set up for angelic contact. And all they needed, like Dr. D getting the stone from the Native Americans, that's the same plot level that Joseph Smith is getting, and it's the same plot level as the Mayan countdown, you see. Dr. D's stone that he's getting the spirit contacts from, that's a Mayan calendar wheel. No wonder that he's seeing into the future in the way that he is. But he's only seeing the planetary math of it. He's not getting the software of the message. That's the thing. You need Kelley to get the message. And so that's why Kelley's software, his Enochian language, which is his own translation of the angelic code, it's like in Contact almost. You got to imagine Sam Yazar and the angels are chained behind the veil, and they're broadcasting their signal. And guys like Rudolph, etc., are trying to facilitate the genius loci, as our guide had said, to get the right frequency to receive the message. And then you get a guy like Kelley who has to be ultimately the focal point and the mouthpiece for the transmission coming through. And so they're able to get Kelley to be that. However, as we know, he does it in such a way that only he understands it. He never publicly or even amongst the elite of Rudolph and the Circle, never gives away the secret, always keeps it to himself in the context of the cashing in. And this is involved in political intrigue plots with the Vatican as well, etc., etc. And you can look at an entire conspiracy on such a grand scale for the control of history that's never even been considered before. What it all comes down to, though, as we know, is Kelley failing and getting trapped in the jar, etc. So, all that background, there's even more and more, but what my main point was, once I realized, following my Mountford look-in on the 20th, once I realized the connection between Sam Yazan, the Planetary Angels, and Prague, I really realized then, the importance of what it means to me in my plot in terms of what I can actually do for the unfinished business of this area of Chapel Perilous that we call Prague, the Magic City. And of course, after having my first encounter with Huor at the Orloi, and then finally on the second night with the dwarf, then preparing for the Nekyia night, I realized that it was all coming together in a focused, let's say, resolution of many, many things. And looking at this idea, just before I get into the narrative of the Nekyia night, my last thing I want to highlight is this idea of the patterning that is created at different parts of the loop. We talked about, all of us, the three of us, including Mike Silva, last night I talked about, from Cleopatra to Rudolph is like the first segment of the human arc. First time the humans have completed one of the doubling arcs. And then from Rudolph to Ben Franklin, that's when things go awry with this arc. And Kelley makes the arc go down instead of having it go up, right? And so the grid is necessary, etc. But being at this point of that, with Rudolph at that point, before things go wrong, you're seeing aspects of the human, patterning. They're going to affect everything after them. And so what those guys do in any event, the Faust pattern that Kelley sets a definitive pattern that it can only be resolved after the next doubling point with Faust Part 2 and the whole Enlightenment approach. And so, for myself and a lot of my understandings of what was going on, I was seeing very clearly how the plot level elements of Nuog, for example, were determined, as everything else is, by this same, in a fractal way, the same pattern that is writing the script for Kelley's downfall. For example, Kelley failed in his plot level, and that is the same reason that Nuog failed, the same reason that Jonestown happened, the same reason that Waco, Texas happened. All these different things are variations with the same perception of the arc, just different content for a personal fill-in. So my difference between me and David Koresh is that I don't have to die to learn the lesson, and I can avoid making the mistake. That's why I was in Prague, and not someone else. So, getting right to the essence of the matter. The meeting with Huor at the Orloi was, as before, a very dark and mysterious. You could feel the tulpa ring, you know, as the Orloi was, you know, staring at me. I could feel almost like the UFO tulpa sound, you know, that hum, that has that weird, numinous hum in the air. And then when that hum is on, that's when the magic occurs. That's when the UFO hypnosis occurs, and the lights shine, etc. So that hum, you know, again, I was very conscious of the fact that it was the exact same hum I had heard in the UFO mothership. And it's the exact same type of through the curtain penetration. That sound is the sound of your consciousness peering behind the curtain in one weird organic way. And my perception again of Huor coming out of the Orloi with his wonderfully constellated hat. And this third night the hat was just bursting with comets and, you know, supernova type, you know, movements of stars and the conjunctions. You can see, you know, as he was moving around the clock in his preliminary dance, like almost stars in his hat coming together in a conjunction to create, like how they talk about the Star of Bethlehem could have been a conjunction of planets, you know, in the sky, etc., and that kind of thing. Following him then on the cobblestone streets through the crowds with the pathways of fire, and very quick, very shifting quickly through the crowds, and feeling again a kind of temporal slippage in my perception. I could feel that by focusing on Huor and his pathway through the eternal aspect of the city, linear time was peeling away and I was going into a very strange, mysterious place. And who knows what someone would have seen if they were watching me disappear through those streets. I mean, I could have just vanished. But to me, I was entering into a very dark and, you know, ancient feeling. And when we get to the fountain, it's the same fountain as before, but, you know, it seems much more, you know, like the time has been layered back even more. And it seemed that this area that Prague is in, of course, as we know, was a meteorite that struck. And I was feeling like some kind of vibration that is a dwarf frequency. And that the dwarf world, which resonates at a slight frequency different than the human world, making them invisible to our senses, that I was getting some kind of feedback and seeing things almost from the dwarf view. And like there's an alternate city of Prague that is the dwarf city located where Prague is. And that this is this curtain interface zone. And that this city of Prague may be the only place in Europe where this phenomenon is happening, and it has to do with the meteorite strike, and this is only even coming to me now, my understanding of this. But looking at the fountain, looking at the interface zone, as I've described before, I step up into the fountain, and the waters kind of would part, and we'd be walking down the stairs, and the stairs are kind of superimposed over the liquid of the fountain. And so, if we're taking the premise that the dwarf world and their city of Prague is in the same physical space as the human city of Prague. And all that's different is the curtain is at a different frequency, so the things that are perceived, the way consciousness is arranged, physical matter and time, the linear time that unfolds, is at a different frequency, so it's two different simultaneous dimensions. But they are interface places, and water within a statuary of mystical charged symbolism at the right place in terms of the telluric currents, right? And you have a statue inside a pool, which the statue itself is like dialing some kind of location software to make a door more visible or more possible. So Neptune or whatever, with the idea that like the statue of Neptune has these cherubim around it. So the cherubim, which are dwarf symbols, are representing some kind of, you know, symbolic code which acts as software to control and regulate the curtain between worlds within the city. And so it's wild, but there's like this interface, and I could really feel it much more on the third night. Everything was much more real on the third night because of my understanding and my preparation and the amount of, you know, consciousness I had prepared and poured into, and plus it was like the last big night. So it was all charged up, and I was seeing much more. And so now, again, I'm going to explore that whole, dual city connection in the future, because that's really hot. Getting on with the narrative, what happened is we went down the staircase as before, but the staircase, we didn't go down the stairs as far down as we did the first time, actually. We stopped maybe about a third of the way down, and there was this platform. Because when I say stairs into the earth, it's like, many different layers of stairs, and different, like, a whole bunch of stairs going down to kind of like an edge, and it kind of like, goes sideways around a rocky cliff and then down more in this winding kind of way. But at one of these pathways, unlike continuing all the way down as before, we went off to the side, and here was this hole in the wall. And as I can remember it now, that, of course, there's like a weird green illumination in the air, right? Not quite like a torchlight, but a green kind of light. And I could see up above, way up above, the light of the door being held open, the curtain being held open by Huor. But aside from that, I'm in this shadowy, kind of half light with this, the dwarf who was my guide, who had appeared at the top of the stairs as before and took me down. We reached this platform and this hole in the wall, and I can see it's like a goddess, the primal goddess, like carved on the wall, and the hole is where her vagina would be. Like in those old Celtic type goddess things, like she's crouching and the big hole is like the cave you have to crawl into. And so the dwarf kind of like reaches out and grabs me, like grabs my shirt, right? And kind of pulls, and so I had to like take off all of my clothes and wrap them up in a bundle and hand them to the dwarf, right? And I had only on my medallion, and I had my ring, my double-headed bird ring. And so he's like kicking me, and I have to crawl into this hole in the wall. And I must say I was less than enthusiastic about crawling into this hole. And it was particularly spooky, but I did it anyway, because obviously, what else am I going to do, right, in the situation? I'm there to play the game. But it was pretty terrifying. And as I had said before, on the first trip I had been allowed to walk down the stairs and then go to this hallway leading down to this arch, and then past the arch is the temple room where the Kore goddess is. And along the hallway between the bottom of the stairs and the arch were these weird reptilian evil women in the walls, right? So now I'm crawling in this tunnel, which is like crawling down, and it's all uneven, and it's all like a dark womb, crawling in there, and grabbing at me from the sides and hissing at me are these women, like, yeah, hey, yeah, and they kept on saying, yo, 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 and they kept grabbing at me, and like, like they're like wriggling out, like, like some kind of Lovecraftian nightmare, like whipping their tails at me, and like trying to pull me in, and I'm really terrified at this point, and I have no idea what the hell's happening. It's totally dark, completely black, and all I have is the dwarf behind me kind of pushing me, right? Pushing me forward, and then like these evil women like biting at me from the sides, and I almost panic at that point. But what happened is I remembered that on the night before, I had a dream where I was flashing back to Wanda and the witches back when I was in, 16, 17 years old during the hut days. And I had this weird kind of dream where I was remembering some of the more intense tortures that I underwent at their beck and call. In particular, though, my so-called initiation night, and that's when that it's getting harder, that evil crone, the evil British-type crone. And I was like remembering, and I don't even know how real this was as far as a memory versus if it was some dream-type integration with the Dune, the similar Dune scenes, where Muad'Dib is being examined by the evil Bene Gesserit crone. Could he be the one? Maybe, I heard like that evil crone saying that in the dream, as if they were saying that about me. But I flashed on that while I was in the dark hell. And what happened is it caused a kind of unfolding, like a nervous, like vomiting up of a bunch of cubes from my hyper being which I was able like to throw at these women. You know, here, chew on this cube of me serving the witches, or chew on this, you know, something, and like, you know, giving up part of myself, and like, you know, as if like transmuting alchemically those memories, which I can manufacture endlessly in the memory palace, in my dungeons of my memory palace. You know, I have like the memories of all the evil women, so I was able to bring that up, and this is a trick that I learned during the UFO, when dealing with the Atlantean women, because they're so alluring and so, you know, oh, and they hypnotize you so much. You have to be able to use, like, your greatest, most powerful sexual fantasies from all of your life as cubes, and, like, feed them to the aura of the Atlantean women, just to be able to talk to an Atlantean woman without just, like, staring, you know, hypnotized, right? So, in the same way with the evil Lemurian women, I fed them the dark Hecate-type themed memories which I had in my memory palace, and I made it through, finally, you know, the terror. It seemed like to go on forever, you know, and I was in shock. You know, I emerged from the womb in, you know, right in front of the statue, you know, in the alcove there of the goddess, right? Shocking event. I have to say, no matter what, it was pretty fucking terrifying. No matter what was going on there, it was easily the most terrifying moment of my whole life. You know, that in the dark, yeah, that, oh my god, it's like unbelievably terrifying. And so, in any event, the after effect here is that, you know, when I get to the finally, you know, kneeling like in front of the Kore statue, and my whole ordeal was in, you know, like the most extreme Greco-Roman sense, the enactment of the descent into the realm of the mothers facing the terrible mother, being consumed by the earth. All these things are enacting this whole plot level, and it's because I had the sincere and well dedicated cubes on hand to offer that I was able to make it. I imagine anyone who even got close to this point before never made it past the evil women. Any magus who was good enough to get the dwarf's attention and get down the stairs before me, chewed up by the women. I could sense even that, like, the bones of, you know, would-be Manus, you know, that they're licking as they're, as they're watching me crawl by, right? And so it was, you know, to the extreme, let's say. In any event, I was able then, I had, like, with the dwarf's approval, I was able to stand up in front of the Kore goddess and reach out and grab the torch, okay? And this was, like, you know, the most supreme effort. I was only able to do it then by empowering my mind with the most beautiful, reverential goddess images, you know, the Womanu, the Arabic Queen Rania imagery, you know, the Apocalypse woman imageries would allow me to stand up out of the shocked hell and grab the torch, you know. And I could feel that, you know, the Kore goddess, like, coming alive, like, starting to move in the very mysterious way, right? And at that point, you know, she lets go of the torch, and I'm holding it, and, you know, like, the dwarf quickly brings me over to the alcove where the Kelley is trapped in the jar, right? And the dwarf grabs Kelley off the shelf, and he pulls the lid off, and I'm, like, taking the flame, right? Taking it and you know, putting it over, you know, burning Kelley in the jar. Burn. He's like, no, this. And so what happens then is like a flash, and Kelley is freed from the jar, and he's, like, you know, devastated on the floor, right? And the Kore goddess comes alive as, you know, as Persephone, and she holds the torch with me, and that's when the door slides, like, the wall slides back, and with the dwarf and Persephone and, like, Kelley, like, you know, in tow, like, you know, dragged behind us, we go through the door, and it's like moving in these secret unknown passageways underneath Prague, going through the dwarf, level. Maybe the dwarves have instant access staircases that cut to the background of any given house in the human Prague. You see, and it's like this idea of like the hidden hyper existence of this dwarf world, very accelerated. In any event, we end up where? In Faust House. We emerge from like behind the bookcase in the room of like the Faust House, and you can tell because there are the two holes. There's a hole in the floor where Faust was supposedly taken to hell, right? And there's also the scar on the ceiling, right, where Satan supposedly burned through the ceiling to get at Kelley during his betrayal. And Kelley was like drawing his magic circle and like trying to hold off the demons supposedly that were blowing back in his face. You see, Kelley was like terrified to go back into that room, but it's the only way for him to ever escape the jar, right? And so all of us enter into the room, and Kelley's like, kicked out onto the floor, and he's, basically makes it into his magic circle, which is still drawn on the floor around the hole in the stone hole in the floor where the devil had taken Faust, supposedly, right underneath the scar where the devil had broken through. And what had happened there is that, that's where Kelley made his last stand, cosmically, right? Was in that room. And he enters into the circle, and by speaking in his Enochian language, okay, that decodes the lock. It opens the door. It opens the lock, and the curtain literally blows back on this one wall in the room, and it had almost very similar to like that in Strahov, the wall that had like the set back checkerboard floor and then the archway. That's exactly the type of thing that was like on the wall. And it's also very similar to in Lord of the Rings when they find the door to Moria, the dwarf realm, right? It's like starlight shines on the wall and it shows the arch, but you have to know the language to get through the door. And so Kelley had locked the door by his own, personal key, and then kind of put it on the shelf. Oh, I'll get back to that later. It's almost like in his cosmic plot, he gets everything that gets him the big, favor of the Emperor, gets him the Faust house, which is, at the time his big reward, getting the house, etc. All his big fame, etc. That's all based on the premise of he's getting the final key to unlock the door to the planetary angels, who they've all been waiting for, so they can pull the trigger on the apocalypse, etc., etc. But he gets all that ready. He draws it out cosmically, gets the arch ready with his language, seals it up. I'll get back to that later. I'm going to have a party first. I'm going to go and exploit some more money out of the Emperor for some false promise about anything. And I'm going to do this and that and be a big man, have a party. And he ends up dying or getting disgraced because he kills the guy in the duel. He gets all arrogant. Instead of opening the door and letting the angels in with Rudolph and who else needs to be in the room, Kepler, whoever else needed to be in the room to break the doorway. Because we've got to remember, Kepler in the scientific movement is still occult angel based. Kepler, who mathematically determines everything about the planets, is doing it because he believes the planets are the physical vessels by which Samyeza's angels control human destiny according to the days of the week in terms of astrology, in terms of the horoscopes in the heavens, right? And so they're all waiting to get into the room and have the door open. Kelley, meanwhile, is up the road, getting his, rocks off at some seance, exploiting some noble lady, to get some, big payoff to go on a, holiday, etc. And so he totally blows it. And while he's in one of these side missions to nowhere on his own time, he gets in an argument with this guy who challenges him for being a charlatan because he's milking the guy's girlfriend on some I'm talking to the dead ancestor that you want to know. Like, the typical 900 number type guy, right? And gets challenged, ends up in a duel, kills the guy, and ends up in jail. Rudolph's all pissed off. You finally have it delivered. I'm cutting you loose. Ends up trying to break out of jail, breaks his leg. And so, while all this is going on, it's all self-created impishness that he falls for. And all of his cosmic energy that he'd been building up and building up with his plot level now is cut off. His gnome abandons him, essentially, right? And he's stuck with an imp, and that's what time it is there. His gnome turns away, and so he ends up everything feeding him into this plot where he's going to end up the tormented prisoner of these Lemurian women in the underworld, right? Meanwhile, the goddess forces, who he's supposed to be serving and hooking up with the angels, are waiting. So we get into the room, he unlocks the door, and what happens is that his arch appears, the archway to Samyeza, with his language, and now finally all he has to do, and it's like almost a dwarf, kind of grabs him and like throws him at the wall. Is so pissed off at Kelley. Erase it, you fucking asshole. Erase it, finally. And he erases the arch, makes it all nice and erased and clean. His language finally is gone. For 400 years, that bastard had it locked. His failed, and nobody could use it but him. That was the problem. So then I step up to the plate, of course, and with proper respectful goddess attitude, I take the torch, and as I hold the torch over the different spots of the arch, I burn with like the Manu vision. I burn the shapes, our cosmic shapes, around, and create the new language. The shapes, as I prove that they were the language, and I've already been prepared. I've already used them to talk to Samyeza, so I know it's the correct language. Now, all that has happened is that the local arch for Prague, and it's all about the double of the Faust House in Dwarfland. That's what the time it is, you see. Faust House isn't even the point. It's about that locale's double in the dwarf city of Prague. The Praha of dwarves. That's what now has been unlocked finally, right? And so now Kore, the goddess, goes up to the doorway, which opens finally, and it's Samyeza and the angels on the other side. And the goddess goes through the door, and now finally her story can get going. Because this had been the only thing holding back the whole transfer, let's say. And I could feel like, this connection again, it's all connected to America and the New World. We got to remember, Dr. D and Kelley's language and this whole angelic thing comes from his Mayan calendar seer stone. And it's all connected to the calendar, which is controlled by the planetary angels. And in the 2012 scenario, the Omega point is just when the angels finally have no control because of the human novelty has driven destiny to a point of quantum indeterminacy when we have now the alpha ability to start over. But until that happens, the planetary angels have to be in charge of the destiny threads that are, going to be forming as, the spiral repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. So the whole spiral form that's sketched out from Cleopatra to Rudolph is, we got to remember, the essential fractal pattern of the human consciousness, which is going to be repeating and doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling. And the clock, the orloi, etc., is the mechanism combined with the calendar, whereby with the influences of the planets, that natural energy can be directed to unfold the rose as according to the goddess plan, blah, blah, blah. So, now finally that's going on. So, with what happened next then, that was the main thing. Then I'm left alone with the dwarf. The Kore, Persephone, the goddess, goes through the door, it closes again, and now, Kelley is, dissolved. He, burns away in the circle, in the center. He just, he's, finally free, okay? That's one consolation. But he doesn't deserve much else. So he's all done, and the stench of him is in the air, and I'm standing there with this dwarf. And what happens next is, the dwarf, you kind of waves his hand over my arch, right? And puts one hand on the arch on the doorway, puts the other hand on my heart over this medallion, and pulls out the Philosopher's Stone, which is the key, as we know. Back in '97, my whole Philosopher's Stone revelation, which goes also into the idea of the Urim and Thummim, of the Joseph Smith seer stones being put together, but it's the Philosopher's Stone, the hyperbody, the 7 planetary forces as one harmonized shape, which is the real human body. And so I was already mastering the planetary angels by mastering the Philosopher's Stone, which is what the philosophers already were claiming that they were going to be doing anyway. It's why the planetary symbols are associated with the elements of the stone in the astrology, alchemy as one lovely world of the philosophers. And so, in any event, like pulling out of my chest, the dwarf takes the stone and is able to put it into the door. And it's not locking the door in the way that Kelley was doing. It's resetting the door. With this now has been determined as the answer. This is the Philosopher's Stone. It is the answer. And the proof is that the dwarf was able to open the door with it. You see. It's very subtle. Kelley was able to open the door himself, all right, while in the circle with his own version of the stone, which was nothing more than his ego distorted into his personal power, language. And he's able to hold it open with his will, channel it, and control it, but then as soon as he leaves the circle, bang, it closes. And no one else can ever open that door, only him. And while he has the door open, he's able to scribble the language, and that forces the shape on the lock, you see. And then he closes it again, and he dies, unfinished business, and it's locked for 400 years. Cut to me returning, setting him free to unlock it, and then he's gone. And now, I'm the magus who redesigns the lock on the door. And my Philosopher's Stone can be used by anyone, and it's correct, and it's simple to solving all of the symbolic problems that Kelley just avoided and refused to ever illuminate, which is why, of course, it was only ever usable by him. But in any event, the fact that the door closed behind the goddess, and then the dwarf was able to use my key to open it, means that now, what Kelley was supposed to have done has been done by me. Manu! So, as that happens, shockingly, when the door opens again, and the dwarf puts the Philosopher's Stone back into me, I undergo metamorphosis. And I begin to feel the strange ion-type moment, where ion meaning the bursting of the head in the hyper sense. And in the dwarf's presence, my head explodes into the crocodile, which is my Sebek head self going back to 2003 and Brother Smith and the whole graduation, when I graduated from the tutelage of Cleopatra in terms of the hyper self. Proof of my graduation was being able to metamorphose into Sebek, which was also only possible, because of the continuing goddess formula which I was putting in play, which again is the alchemy formula. And so it's no coincidence that when I'm in Prague, all of the different things that I've already been doing for years now are jumping right to the fore as the necessary techniques or responses which I would have to have on the scene. So literally only me could have been in that situation and done what I was doing. And, it's no coincidence that in the Strahov Monastery, or no, in Strahov Monastery they have a crocodile, but in Karlstein, which we had seen on the day before, they had a huge crocodile head, which they said, oh well, that is what they would assume to be a dragon, right? And etc., etc. So my crocodile head explodes when I'm standing in Kelley's magic circle, okay? And the door is open, and the dwarf takes me through the door, and we step through it, and I change again now from being just the crocodile-headed me, and now I change into a complete crocodile, because as we step through the door, we're suddenly underwater, right? And we had been now, remember, somewhere across the Charles Bridge, past the Orloy, in the old town, section, whatever. This now, we're moving through some water, and we're going under the river, the Vltava, or whatever the river is that flows under the Charles Bridge, to the side where the royal palace is. And I become the crocodile in full, and this is again right out of the Joseph Smith facsimiles, you know, the crocodile god flowing through the Nile into the land of the dead to the other side. And I have the dwarf with me, like riding on my back. And we go underneath the water and come up in this cave. And as we emerge up in this cave, you know, there's like the transformation occurs again, and I'm, you know, still got the crocodile head, and now I'm back into the human body, and I have the medallion on still. And one thing I have to mention, by the way, is before, like when we're still in Faust's house, when I first just burst the head, and I still had the human body, the dwarf took my ring off, my double-headed bird ring, and he put it on. And then when that happened, and we went to step through the door, that's when I changed into the full crocodile. And I came out, once we've come out of the water, in this cave, and I changed back from being the full crocodile into just the crocodile head, and the dwarf gave me back the ring. And so somehow my double-headed bird ring was linked in some way to my complete theriomorphy, or changing into the cosmic power animal, okay? But what happens in this cavern, in any event, is me with the crocodile head and the dwarf. We're approaching this big, regal, kind of like a real, you know, Tomb of Balin, Lord of the Rings type cavern, which seems to be more like a basement, you know, like medieval style basement. And I realize it's essentially the kind of tomb where the kings would be buried, and in fact, it is, you see, a kind of Land of the Dead double of Rudolph's tomb. And Rudolph himself is laying on the elevated casket in the middle of this chamber, and surrounding him are 7 dwarves, and each one of them has like armor on. They're very old in the kind of old Europe way. And as with the dwarf who was guiding me, not bearded, surprisingly, in the typical Tolkien way. Instead, more like short, either a short beard or not even like any beard at all, and more kind of like in a you know, very esoteric type culture of dwarves, which I haven't seen before. In any event, there's 7 of them. Each one of them has, however, a helmet with one of the 7 planetary spheres, and they're kind of like guarding around Rudolph and looking very morose at him as he's laying there. And I can see his eyes are open, like half open, and he's kind of staring up, and up at the sky is like, you know, this huge panorama of, you know, all these different wheels and alchemical diagrams and symbols and things that he's like contemplating, the wheels of destiny, etc. And he's in like a self-imposed hypnosis of melancholy, and he's chained, I can see, by these, you know, gargoyle-like claws that are like these chains which are holding him down. And the dwarf kind of nudges me, like pointing at Rudolph, and I realize what I have to do, and I rush forward as with my crocodile head, and I chew and bite at these chains, and I break them and, you know, shatter them, and, you know, Rudolph's like, you know, stirred awake, and he's just, you know, stunned. He's stunned by this mysterious, voluminous figure that suddenly rescued him from his torpor. And the dwarves are like shocked, and they're like, you know, jumping up and down, and, you know, yelling, and my dwarf guide is talking to them, and it, you know, it's a very hushed and, you know, mysterious sequence of events. And Rudolph is like, you know, sits up, and he's like, you know, stunned. He like looks at me, and I open the crocodile mouth, and underneath my tongue is the Philosopher's Stone, right? And I open up the crocodile mouth, and Rudolph like reaches in and grabs the stone. And at that point, the dwarf grabs my hand, pulls the ring off, and I have like the shocking transformation, and I become the full crocodile, right? And, you know, the dwarf gets on my back, and it's like we're out of there. We leave immediately, and like Rudolph is like looking at my version of the stone. It's like all making sense to him, like he's been woken up and finally given. and it's like he needs to have a very private moment with the himself and his dwarves about finally having the stone, and like they're looking, the dwarves themselves are like, oh yeah, looking at it, and Rudolph is like shocked to have it, and I delivered the Philosopher's Stone to His Majesty Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, of the Order of the Golden Fleece. I gave him the Golden Fleece at last, you see. Golden Fleece is code for the Philosopher's Stone. And so the dwarf rides me out of there into the waters again, and we're just like through the dark, unknown waters, and out again finally on some riverside, place on the other side, but in an unknown area. And here's another shocking denouement to the whole thing. First of all, I metamorphose back into the human in a very weird, bizarre way as soon as he gives me back my ring. And then he hands me my clothes. Now don't ask me how my clothes were dry, since the dwarf was underwater with me, since I don't know the answer to that question. Okay? And then he hands me my passport. Right? And he opens up my passport, and the Philosopher's Stone is like on the passport, and he closes it up, right? And he hands it to me, and he says Columbia. And now that's the second bizarre thing, because I did not have my passport with me. And even if it was with me, there's no way it would have survived the underwater world that we were in. And what the hell is going on with that? Did the dwarf somehow just... And it was still in my pocket when I got back to the hotel room. So something was going on. In any event, the feeling I got as far as the passport connection is that it's a physical piece of Columbia. It's the United States government document connecting me on the international global level to Columbia, the United States. So, in any event, it's unhealthy to speculate too much on what exactly is going on there in terms of how the passport showed up in the hand of the dwarf in the unknown by the riverside moment. However, he then quickly bailed on me and left me stranded in the middle of nowhere. And I could see where I was, like the shimmering of the in-between worlds, like the weird... I'm beginning to think now, like this feeling of going back in time as I'm walking through the streets. It's not even necessarily going back in time as much as it is seeing the dwarf otherworld. The parallel world of the dwarves, which is set and probably designed to look like older in terms of the human culture, because they probably prefer how the human culture looked in Rudolph's time to how Prague looks today. So on and so forth. The dwarves, the local to Prague. But there's a specific dual city that's going on there, with the double-headed bird being another example of the two faces to everything happening in Prague. The magic around every corner. In any event, I finally made it back to the hotel room after some misadventure in some unknown bar and a taxi ride, that may have brought me back to the world of the humans finally. And I finally got back, and I had just the shocking afterwards, just stunned by all the events, and feeling that I had accomplished something in the sense of Kelley's now a solved issue. His language is no longer the problem, and no matter what, I have made some kind of connection established between Samyeza and the goddess, which no one has made before. And that's the key, is that it did facilitate the Mistress plan no matter what happened. And there's a dwarf level now, and the dwarf parallelism with the cities is the next angle to pursue in terms of where this could go next. But for now, I just have to say, the connection symbolically now, wrapping it up, between Prague and the United States, and Prague and Washington, D.C., and the car of history, etc., etc., all of these things now are going to be seen to be a flowing, pulsing, finally connected circuit. And all of the themes connected to the Rudolphian era and how it's being satisfied and brought to the fore by the grid and the Rosicrucian Freemasonry transition in the Saint Germain period in terms of the awakening of the Rosicrucian element on the conscious level as Freemasonry and the New World Order, etc., etc. All of those things connected to the 1881 Trithemius prophecy, connected to the final revelation on Kepler and the astrology, astronomy linkages, etc. It's all a wonderfully flowing old world into new world circuit. The force finally flowing properly. This is the kind of flow that you see with the Da Vinci Code, for example. They tried to throw the switch on and look at how we can reconnect things in the pulsing. But no coincidence that Dan Brown's book on DC has been a failure and he's not been able to finish it. Because he doesn't know how to connect those symbols. But I know. And I'm very happy and zealous about the results of the Prague DC linkage and how now with these events which have occurred, and particularly the Enochian questions being resolved, we're finally ready for the end of the grid during its last year, and it is all good. So we'll zoom in at the end on the car of history and the Prague Tarot that we got, the Tarot of Prague, with the car of history over the chariot, which, as we know, connects to Cleo and the car of history in the capital of Washington, D.C. Manu!